I am really excited to introduce Benjamin Rubin as our first governance track speaker. Benjamin has been studying the intersection of social science and biology for the past 4 years at Hampshire College. He's interested in the intersections between biotech and politics and hopes that we can leverage bioengineering to create a more sustainable, healthy, and socially just world. His talk on the need for participatory governance related to bioengineering for insect disease and pest management is strongly rooted in his belief that experimental and grassroots approaches to politics should centralize public involvement. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Benjamin.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really excited. I love chloroplasts, so it's my favorite organelle, so I'm also very glad that we can be in the chloroplast room. So I'm just going to jump right in. Let me share my screen. Hey, can everyone see my screen? I'm good.
Yep.
All right, so so thanks for having me. So I think this is and thank you Yongbi and Desiree facilitating. So this is I think this is a tricky and complex topic, and obviously governance is also in and of itself is quite challenging. And the kind of technicalities behind bioengineering insects is a lot to get into. So I'll do my best to try to cover the basics, and then I hope in the end we can have a kind of group exercise together. So this is kind of the outline of what I want to talk about. I'm kind of going to go over, what are these insects that we're referring to that are you might broadly think of as problem organisms, even though it's a kind of tricky term. Disease vectors, invasives, and pests. And I want to talk specifically about this bioengineering technology referred to as gene drives, which is really a collection of different technologies. And then I want to talk a little about who's really doing this research, who's developing gene drives. And then I want to talk about some of the kind of general challenges in governing gene drive technologies. So if you're a little confused about what gene drives are, in a moment I will explain, but first I'm going to start with problem organism. So really I want to talk about I want to start with disease vectors, and this is kind of one of the biggest problem organisms, so to speak. You really have mosquitoes as the kind of primary one, being responsible for almost 50% of all human deaths across history as an estimate. They're very notorious. They're all over the world, essentially. They cause a tremendous amount of different diseases, a very diverse array of pathogens. And then next, in addition to disease vectors, there's invasives, which are, although there's a lot of disagreement about how exactly to define invasives, but I would generally think of them as organisms that have entered ecosystems and are causing different disruptions to the ecosystem. So they might be spreading diseases, they might be outcompeting other organisms. And generally, in terms of insects, there's the hemlock woolly adelgid and emerald ash borer are two of the main ones that kill certain trees. And they are really a leading cause of biodiversity loss and extinction. So they're a major threat. And I also really want to emphasize, of course, that humans essentially humans bring in a lot of invasives. We are one of the primary organisms that facilitate, the movement of other invasives into ecosystems. So we're that's kind of on us in many ways. And the third one, in addition to disease vectors, invasives are pests. And I'm really thinking of agricultural pests, which cause tremendous losses to crops every year. And they also, in addition to that, they also can spread diseases to livestock. So these are just a few, just as examples. And they also, of course, threaten food security. So they're a big risk. So yeah, so these three, so disease vectors like mosquitoes, invasives, and agricultural pests, these are kind of problem organisms, so to speak, that have posed challenges for human society. And then really, I also want to emphasize, unfortunately, that climate change is really exacerbating and exhausting a lot of these different organisms. They're kind of making the problem worse. For example, with mosquitoes, climate change is, there's some data that's showing climate change increases the breeding season of mosquitoes. So they are a big threat. And the other unfortunate issue is that a lot of our techniques for controlling problem organisms are kind of failing, or they're running against different challenges. So for example, different sprays and poisons like insecticides, or these organisms evolve resistance to them. They're also, they can also be very toxic. Medical treatments for different pathogens, the pathogens can evolve resistance. And then there's manual applications like bed nets for mosquitoes or physical removal of invasives. These take a lot of work to really do. You have to get people out in the field. So that's a big issue. Those are all challenges. So moving on to this kind of topic, what I really want to talk about are gene drives, essentially. And some folks might be more or less familiar with gene drives, but and this is where there's a lot of technical challenges to describe, but I'll do my best to really break it down and how far I understand. I don't think you need to understand gene drives on a super technical level to get basically what they do. So for a long time, there have been attempts to bioengineer insects to reduce their populations. It's been something that researchers have talked about ever since we knew what DNA was. And around 2003, someone came up with this idea of a gene drive, which is essentially about biasing inheritance or changing rates of inheritance of certain traits. So normally most genes, generally speaking, will be passed on a population at 50% efficiency. As you can see kind of in the top graph with, say, a red flower. With a gene drive, though, you change the inheritance rate to 100% efficiency. So you really jump over the normal laws of inheritance, and you literally can drive a gene or set of traits through a population. And this is really, let's just take a moment to think about, what does this really mean? This is kind of overcoming traditional laws of inheritance. This is a way of getting a gene into a population, that's more powerful than any other technique or any natural mechanism in genetics. So what it means essentially is that you can actually change you can change an entire wild species of organisms. If, say, you modify one group to have the gene drive, they mate with a group of wild species, and they pass on that gene at 100% rate efficiency. So the gene doesn't disappear, it sticks around, and it's prioritized in its spread. So it's more likely to spread than the other genes. So you can go from 50% inheritance to 100% inheritance. So, and then of course, CRISPR-Cas9 is this, as many folks may be familiar with, is what has enabled this more recently. It's really one of the most precise and powerful gene editing technologies. And it's essentially people like to think of it as molecular scissors. So you can cut DNA at very precise locations and make very targeted edits. So this was only really enabled by CRISPR-Cas9, I should emphasize. And then the other thing I'd say, so this was actually first proven to work in the lab in 2015, which is only 3 years after CRISPR-Cas9 came on the scene. And it was first used in yeast, or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and then in fruit flies. And then it was used, of course, in mosquitoes. So in lab settings, it was demonstrated that you could actually spread a trait through a population at 100% efficiency. And I'm going to talk in a moment about what these traits entail, because it might be a little vague, but I also want to emphasize, well, I'll just go into it. So there's kind of two general classifications of gene drives. One is population suppression. So this is where you can actually, this is kind of this idea of an exterminator mechanism where you can actually send out a gene that gets into a population and actually kills off species. And it might be a little confusing because, you know, how are you going to spread a gene if the organisms die? Well, if you send out enough genetically modified organisms that have this gene drive and they mate with enough wild members of the population, then eventually that, and on top of that, if the gene spreads at 100% efficiency every time two organisms mate, then you can basically establish a gene in the population you're given alteration. So one example with population suppression is a sex ratio distorter. So you can actually have a gene drive that makes it so offspring only produce males. So there's no females. So they can't even mate anymore. So what eventually happens is that these populations will crash. You actually can kill off entire populations. This is incredibly powerful, and it's been demonstrated to work in a lab in terms of the population crash. So then you have population modification, which is different. Your gene drive can carry, instead of maybe disabling a gene or introducing a trait that kills off organisms, you can have something like a gene that grants immunity to the host organism. So so say, you know, mosquitoes that carry malaria, you can actually give them a trait that allows them to be immune to malaria. So that's below, you can see the Plasmodium parasite, which is what causes malaria. And malaria and this is really one of the main investments for gene drives, because malaria kills around several 100,000 people every year. It is the most devastating mosquito-borne illness. So this is a kind of concern with gene drives, is the irreversibility that I'm kind of hinting at, is will these get stuck? Will they make permanent changes to populations? This is very kind of frightening to think about. And so far no one has released gene drives, thankfully, because there's a lot more work to be done. But what we have done is a tremendous amount of simulations. And many simulations, such as this one, which has gotten a lot of attention, have suggested that they may act irreversibly. They might make changes beyond even what we might have imagined. So they might spread uncontrollably, in a sense, these gene drives. And maybe this could be a good thing, say, for if you want to get rid of malaria, but there might be consequences with other examples. So actually, there have been a lot of developments to have control mechanisms with gene drives that actually slow them down or make them phase out over time. So, there's a recognition that this is a concern, that gene drives will just spread, that these modifications will spread uncontrollably. So actually, there's different ways that are being developed just now, very recently, that allow the gene drives to either fade out over time, or they can be reversed potentially. So you can even send out another gene drive that will kind of neutralize the first one. But these again haven't entirely been demonstrated to work necessarily, particularly not in the wild, and somewhat in the lab. But there's a lot of uncertainty, as I think uncertainty is really is a big issue, obviously, when it comes to science in general, but when it comes to changing entire populations, this is a big area of uncertainty. So then, of course, one of the biggest concerns really is, you know, whether or not, however successful gene drives might be, what are the ecological repercussions? What happens to food webs when you get rid of, say, mosquitoes or even invasives that have been around for a little while, or pests that cause damage to crops? What happens if we actually have the power now to kill off or alter entire populations, and what are the consequences ecologically? This is a big question, and how can we really assess this? Simulations can only go so far, for example. So one concern, as an example, is say you get rid of malaria and you actually make mosquitoes resistant to malaria. Does another pathogen take its place? A different, potentially more deadly pathogen? Or even if you get rid of mosquitoes or some species of mosquitoes that cause pathogens, what about all the organisms that depend on them for food? This is a big concern. So now I kind of want to switch a bit to talk a little about who's doing all this, because there are a lot of people involved, and it can be a little overwhelming to trace. So I'm not going to try to cover everyone, of course, but I just want to point to a few. You have sculpting evolution, which is at MIT Media Lab. You have target malaria at Imperial College. You have Tata Institute for Genetics and Society, and Genetic Biocontrol Invasive Earth. So you have these different institutions that are doing the research, and they're located throughout the world. And then you also have at the bottom, you can see Outreach Network for Gene Drive Research, Gene Convene, through Foundation for National Institute of Health. Those are more kind of networking organizations that oversee research and help coordinate research. And then you also have the funders of research. The biggest one is really the Gates Foundation. And I should also mention the Gates Foundation is in and of itself is the largest funder of gene drive research. And then you have Open Philanthropy Project, which was started by one of the Facebook co-founders. And then also one that a lot of people, that makes people uneasy, is DARPA, which is actually the US military. And they fund a lot of genetic engineering technology and synthetic biology and so on. But they're actually funding it to be more safe. But a lot of critics still are concerned that, say, that they would fund it as a potential bioweapon, which is very frightening to think about. So there are groups that I think we should, they get dismissed a lot, but I think they're doing valuable work and asking really good questions. But these are environmental groups that are skeptical about gene drives and are concerned about some of what I'm mentioning. And it's not that scientists themselves and policymakers are not concerned. It's just that I think there's different focuses on what concerns to prioritize, and what to do about those concerns. So ETC group is a kind of technology monitoring group. Stop Gene Drives is more pretty openly against them. Friends of the Earth is an environmental group. So there have been efforts to have a moratorium on gene drives, which is essentially means halting research. And there was a moratorium that was attempted to be made at the UN Biodiversity Summit in 2018, of which, just to say, the US is not a signer, which is where I'm located, the US. But anyway, it didn't get passed. There were a lot of groups that were advocating for it, but eventually the people making decisions at the Biodiversity Summit decided against it. They decided to proceed with caution with gene drive research, but they thought a moratorium, which again would mean completely stopping research. They thought that would be too much. And there's still some efforts to bring up a moratorium again, and there's some debate about if maybe a moratorium is not a bad idea. if this technology is too risky. And that there's going to be another biodiversity summit, of course, and that's going to be a topic. So I really, just to kind of round out, there's a lot of kind of addressed, and it might be a little disorienting, but I just want to really emphasize that gene drives are a very powerful technology. They have not yet been released. They're in very early stages. And again, these kind of reversal drives are limited. These different mechanisms that are being put in place to try to control gene drives are, of course, being carried out, but there's still some thought that gene drives would actually be released into the wild without these mechanisms, say to get rid of malaria. So what I kind of want to turn our attention to, and what I want to focus on a little bit for the rest of this session, is how is the public involved in gene drive research and governance? So, and I put the public in quotation marks, so I think it's a weird divide. You know, obviously scientists and policymakers are part of the public, but so, you know, thinking about everyday people, so to speak, or kind of citizens who don't necessarily have expertise in gene drive research, how are they, or how are we involved in gene drives and in their governance, essentially? So just thinking about some of the main challenges, I mean, who gets to decide what these risks are? Who gets to decide when to proceed safely? What does the risk assessment entail? How do we know that we have enough information to decide what to do? And again, thinking about this kind of local communities versus worldwide communities. I mean, if gene drives can potentially spread across the world, then who should be consulted? Who should make decisions about this if potentially everyone is affected? And the communities that are making decisions, what space do they have to make decisions? What opportunities are there? Is there just spaces in which communities are being informed and educated, or do communities actually have a say in what happens? Do they have an ability to challenge the narratives? Do they have an ability to ask the questions themselves? And then finally, another thing to consider is alternative techniques for biocontrol, for controlling problematic organisms. You know, there's such as, you know, say investments in local community healers, in public health, or other ways of controlling, say, mosquitoes like Wolbachia bacteria you may have heard of. So really what that's asking is, you know, gene drives don't have to be the only answer. They might be very powerful and effective in some way, but they might also be too risky. So there's a risk that gene drives can kind of overshadow other possibilities. So now I want to really shift, and this is where I want to get everyone's thoughts together. And I think we can, you know, obviously we're all on Zoom. It can be a little tricky, but I would really love to hear from folks. Just to kind of brainstorm together. You know, there's no hard end rules about what to think about, but I would love to hear what folks think about in terms of how can we come together and kind of govern these gene drives? How can kind of the public involvement be coordinated to govern gene drives? How can the kind of values of community biology be taken into account to govern gene drives? So in other words, how can you move away just from experts like scientists or policymakers being the only people to govern gene drives? How can you have everyday people, so to speak, involved in this decision making? So I'm gonna open up the space a little bit. Let me, and kind of give the floor to anyone who wants to kind of jump in.
Yeah, so at this point, if you could, seem to be having some difficulty finding the hands up button, but if you could go into the reactions section and do a clap, if you have something that you want to say to contribute, then we'll go about and unmute you, and then we'll see what comes out. And if you could just introduce yourself when you're doing that, with your name and where you are in the world, that'd be fantastic.
Wait, so do you want me to unmute everyone now?
Just anybody that has the, oh, fantastic. So it appears that the hands up thing is at the bottom of the participant thing. All right, perfect. And I see Eric Schott from Maryland. He has raised his hand up. So if we could unmute Eric.
Unmuted, all right. Benjamin, that was great. I really appreciate that overview. One of the things that your last set of questions makes me think about is the need for scientists. I'm a university-trained scientist, faculty member at the University of Maryland, and there's a great need for us to meet, as you said, like the general public, meet people where they are with these issues and not expect them to understand what we're saying when we say it in our jargon. And the last 10 years I've found how difficult that is, and I've moved from thinking that it's somebody else's job or that someone's going to even show me how to do it, just saying we have to do it ourselves. So I want to appreciate you saying that and agree that we have to meet people where they are. That does two things. It makes sure that they're involved, but it also, I think, addresses an underlying mistrust of science in society right now. And I think that being experts and saying, just listen to us because we're experts hasn't helped things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I think that's a really valuable insight because there's some people talk about the kind of deficit model of science communication, of there being that the public is uninformed and doesn't know anything, and that we need to tell them how it is, and if they understand how it works, then they'll make good decisions. But I think there's a different approach of, well, what can we learn from the public, and how can we work collaboratively where we all have valuable insights to offer, I think is probably more successful. And it's challenging too, of course. So other folks, does that make people think of any other ideas for where to begin or what to start thinking about? Matthew, is your hand raised? Or?
Yeah, I can jump in. My name is Matthew. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And right now, for the last couple of years, we've had a lot of issues with an invasive species known as the spotted lanternfly. And kind of like public information sharing about how to deal with that has been really led by like local parks departments and like local media. And I think that's really important. At the same time, there's a lot of people sharing things on Facebook, and there's a whole bunch of like misinformation on that. But I think if you have like if you're a local expert in kind of conservation or in biology or something like that, and working with your local media sources to like vet information is really important. I know some of the professors that I worked with at Lehigh University were like involved in rolling out information to the public through like local parks departments, signage and stuff like that. So I feel like gene drives is it's tricky because it's more complicated than a traditional conservation invasive species. Maybe there is a way for local media and local like government agricultural centers to partner with knowledge makers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important element of it is partnering with existing structures that are in place, and not, you can go rogue, so to speak, and just do your own thing. But it's nice to see what researchers are around and that there are other people interested in similar questions. So sometimes it's just a matter of looking around. Andy, do you want to offer something?
Yeah, sorry, my internet can be atrocious. I'm also in Philadelphia and can see spotted lanternflies from where I am. They are everywhere. But I think, in talking about this, scientists being more responsible for communicating their science and not just assuming that people will listen to them because they're experts, because we really do have a crisis of expertise that's manifesting in all sorts of ways right now. But I think also some acknowledgement of why things like gene drives might be potentially troubling technologies for a lot of people, especially when you're talking about technologies between the global north and global south. Like the malaria concern bridges that global north. A lot of the science is happening in the global north, and a lot of the implementation is planned for the global south. So a lot of the concerns around these sorts of technology between the global north and global south have to do with intellectual property, theft, and appropriation. And I think that those sorts of questions have to be addressed, not just the ecological questions. But then, of course, there are also those ecological questions that people in the past, one of the biggest hot button issues for these types of technologies has been the potential for an invasive species. And this is effectively intentional. The fact that ecology they're such complex systems that it's very difficult for simulations or anything to do an adequate job of anticipating their effects. And so the precautionary principle has guided this type of research for that reason. And now when you're talking about intentionally doing a small thing that could have a massive cascading effect in an ecosystem, I think people are justifiably worried about that in a lot of ways. And so, there needs to be, I think, some sort of retroactive therapeutic sort of communication before the questions of like, how do we more accurately describe gene drives to people? How do we better represent ourselves in media and things like that become questions.
I also just want to say there is some work I didn't really get to mention, is there is some work going on. Of course, the people developing gene drives are asking these questions, as I said, but there is some pretty admirable work going on to actually make these efforts. So for example, the Sculpting Evolution has a program called Mice Against Ticks, which has done great work in consulting communities in Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Islands off the coast of Massachusetts, to kind of look into gene drives for malaria removal. And they've really done this work to kind of start at the community level before they even develop the technology.
So it looks like Craig might have a question or a comment.
Hi, yeah, definitely. So it's quite an interesting topic given the variety of organisms we're exploring, research into gene drives into. We all can agree that, mosquitoes prolifically with malaria is a huge travesty, which probably leads to why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is investing so much into the research of it. But the question is, once we start to research and put efforts into these and start deploying them, what are the other considerations? Because it's another tool in the toolbox, and the question is, okay, what's the scale of appropriate use and deployment? So a lot of the research that I do is based around soil ecology and bioremediation by kind of moving more towards biodiversity. And when you look at a disturbance event, often the reason why you have an emergence of these species is because the natural ecology has been disturbed, creating a hole for this ecological niche. So the reality is there's a lot more nuance. A lot of the research that I do is looking for a lot of biological techniques and, just using the entomopathogenic fungi or microbes that are ambiently out there that basically can fill these microbial niches. But I think definitely it's something where, as it's progressing right now, the amount of investment, research, industry to that capacity, it's important to say, how do we deploy these actions? Because there's a whole panoply of different actors and organizations and institutions and states and bodies that want to see good from this. But yeah, it's a really interesting ethical dilemma when we have this incredible, powerful tools that allow us to edit and perform these gene drives even with more precision. So it's something that, what are the ways we can look to restore biodiversity, which might alleviate, and then might that be the nuclear option in for some extreme cases?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Craig. Yeah, and it's good to see you. I don't know if you remember me from around from a mushroom festival.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I remember now. Yeah, New Moon.
Does anyone else, anyone who hasn't spoken up?
So,
No wrong answers.
so I'm gonna take the MC's prerogative and just put something in there. So it was really interesting hearing this conversation, and I kind of gravitated back towards this concept of expertise and accessibility, right? So this idea of this information being accessible and understandable. And I think there's a really big problem that happens in terms of accessibility to the fora that people actually get to have these discussions about, and those fora tend not to include the public. So nominally they say that they do. If you want to participate in some sort of public NASEM event or something like that, nominally you can, but how many individuals have the resources to get tickets and fly to DC and stay at a hotel and think of up the things that they want to say about a very complex topic? So in terms of something that might be a potential solution, or at least a satisficing approach, might be, this is a community that's exceptionally diverse. This is a community that has broad practitioners from academia, industry, and government to, home practitioners, explorers, innovators. So really trying to find ways to build those bridges with individuals that already have the access, who then can act as advocates, at least as a stopgap measure initially, and then using that as a kind of wedge to then allow more and more public kind of, public kind of interactions, feed into those spaces, may be a way to start that process. That's something that I've kind of wondered and thought about.
I think we just have about 1 or 2 minutes left. Is there anyone who wants to just chime in? A final thought or anything?
I mean, I'm surprised Alex Perlman hasn't said anything.
You guys, the live stream didn't record to YouTube, so I'm bugging out. Okay, I have a 8-screen experience happening right now. But Yangbi, thanks so much for bringing that up. I mangling your name in the chat because I'm typing 18 different things. But I think it's a really key suggestion and just observation that I think a lot of us here, and even some folks who have already spoken, have a lot of knowledge and networks and institutional friends, colleagues, partnerships, who listen to our voices and value our voices. And it's our job to use those relationships and networks to bring more voices in from the outside, and bring in our colleagues from this community and other marginalized communities who might not have those connections and might not have those resources and the privilege to, like you say, attend events where these decisions are happening. And so it's everyone deserves to be in the room where it happens. I'm going to just throw that out at you, Yanni. And, but the thing is that the room is quite closed and the door is closed. And so the more that we shove our feet and our elbows in the door and open it for others, the better it's going to be for, the world, and resolving a lot of these issues and getting our voices heard in the, someone brought up local media, someone brought up local governance. So even on a small level up to, the big decision makers, if you see an issue, but you maybe don't have the resources or the networks that you feel that you can make a difference, there are plenty of people in this community who you should be reaching out to and say hey, I have an idea. Can you connect me to this person? I see you know them on LinkedIn, or they work at your university where you're a researcher or whatever. And we should all be serving to like help each other and making partnerships with those connections. So I'm going back to my, my phone.
Please do. But that brings us to the end of Benjamin's talk. Benjamin, thank you so much for your insights and your, like education, and just for really putting it out there in this discussion on the inaugural talk of the governance track of BioSummit. So thank you so much. Snaps if people, or claps for Benjamin.
Yes, thank you so much, Benjamin. So great to have you here. Thank you. And thank you, Young B. Woohoo!